Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Secure IT podcast. I'm your host, Jason Kikta. Really great to have you back with us here in the new year, 2026, coming in strong and a lot of excitement this year on the technology front. I think this is going to be, a really evolving and changing year compared to 2025. And speaking of evolving and changing, obviously, you'll notice that we've changed the name of the podcast. No longer CISO IT, now Secure IT. Both better to capture the true nature of the podcast and also to reflect the fact that I am no longer solely the CISO and senior VP of product here at Automox, but now I am the CTO, and as the CTO, I oversee engineering, product, and security and IT. So I wear many hats because I'm really terrible at telling my CEO no, but couldn't be happier to be here on the show and happier to do what I'm doing. And another change for us today, we have a guest, our first time in a long time. So I'm going to jump right into it without further ado. But Mark Cooper has joined us from PKI Solutions today. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason. And I'm honored to be on the first of the newly branded podcast for the year. So thanks for that. I'm Mark Cooper. I'm the former president. I'm now the CEO and founder of PKI Solutions. Started the company about 12 years ago. We work with enterprises on identity and access management using public key infrastructure.
Awesome. All right, let's get into it. Okay, Mark. So why don't we start off? I When I found out about PKI Solutions and you had a discussion with me about it, it really fascinating. I think it'd be really helpful for the audience as well to understand your company, how it came about, what you all do, because I think it helps explain some of the topics that we're going to get into and how that's your area of expertise and what kind of visibility you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in IT for many decades, so I'll just kind of jump to the PKI related stuff. In the early 2000s, I wound up at Microsoft and spent a decade there working on public key infrastructure with Microsoft's largest customers, setting up environments, responding to critical issues, creating things like health checks, and frankly, even training Microsoft engineers on it. Probably like a lot of your audience, PKI scares a lot of people. It was one of those things that early on made a lot of sense to me. I left in 2014 and started PKI Solutions originally just as a consulting organization, working with a lot of the same organizations around the world. About 5 years ago, we had an opportunity to start solving a problem we kept seeing. A lot of the organizations we would work with would have security related issues or reliability or resilience issues within the PKI itself, meaning they were dependent on certificates, whether it's endpoints or firewalls or point of sale systems. And inevitably, the PKI didn't meet their resilience needs or consistently had security related issues that consulting alone couldn't solve. And that's when we created a product called PKI Spotlight. So I often say there's an established set of tools out there called certificate lifecycle management. Probably a lot of your audience knows about things like Jam for Microsoft Intune or Venafi. All of these things are really focused on what we describe as the output of a factory, meaning the things that come out the door, go onto endpoints, firewalls, servers. And that is an important problem to solve. And there's a lot of great tools there. But inevitably, we found that organizations were struggling with operating the PKI, meaning is it up and running and reliable and resilient? And I think one of the things that you and I spoke about is things like high availability and having a recovery option is not the same
Mhm.
as resilience. And that's
Right.
what we really set out to change.
That's awesome. So, I always focus a great deal on this podcast about being accessible because there's always new people coming into the industry, new people moving up, and I want to make sure that we're supporting them in their growth and their learning as well. So, at a very just high level, can you explain what PKI is and what it does for us, why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the important thing is most organizations already have a PKI. So this is an
Yep.
interesting space that if you're the IT person at the organization or you're kind of coming up to the ranks and no one said PKI to you, the odds are it's probably there. It just isn't part of the conversation. Again, going back to if it's scary, we tend not to talk about these things. So public key infrastructure is a set of servers and software that create identities that go onto devices, firewalls, laptops, servers, as well as to users. And the intent is to provide the ability for them to identify and authenticate without passwords. So we talk a lot about passwordless authentication, and there's lots of different schemes that are out there. PKI is the most prevalent method where we can put a certificate, the identity, onto a device, and without having to have a password, that device can say, hey, I belong to an organization and I want to connect to a firewall. I want to connect to a web server. Same thing with the user. I don't have to give the user a password. And we can do really interesting things like take that certificate, put it onto a two-factor device. Now, whenever the user signs in, they can have that two-factor device. We also see it a lot in Internet of Things. So smart
Mhm.
thermostats, smart cars, every Boeing and Airbus airplane, most IoT things are using certificates to do this process. What's nice is it is a highly resilient technology when deployed the right way, but without the right tools and the oversight, we do see problems.
Well, and I think the other thing too is people don't even understand where it's even where they might think of something as being like, oh, my TLS connection in my web browser
Hmm.
is, that's symmetric encryption. And the answer is,
Yeah.
well, yes,
Yes.
after the
But
PKI kickstarts the session and supports
exactly.
the secure certificate exchange. So, you know,
Exactly.
it's just so ubiquitous, but so underappreciated that it was, you know, that's the part that always surprises me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example that, if you've ever gotten a certificate from a environment to get onto a web server and you're dealing with that TLS. Hopefully, you're doing it the right way, which means you got that certificate from a PKI. The naughty way of doing that is to have a self-signed certificate. This is a bit like you sitting down, drawing out a driver's license, and then walking up to someone saying, "Hey, I'm Bob Smith, and here's my driver." No one's going to trust that. You have to go through great lengths.
Frowned
When
upon.
you do that self-signed certificate, you've got to walk around everywhere. So when you stand up that server and people are like, I can't connect to the server, you go, oh, here's a copy of the certificate. You're shortchanging the process. You're really eliminating. And we really kind of call that as you're not doing PKI, you're using certificates without a PKI.
Right.
That's not a scalable thing.
Absolutely. So I'd like to shift into threat model because this is so foundational and yet I think so poorly misunderstood, especially the ubiquity of it and how it's just embedded in our everyday tech lives and our businesses. That threat model is very important, but I think underappreciated. So what does it look like for something like high end threats? What do you all see? What are you worried about?
Yeah. So, for many, many years, we talked about theoretical threats of, where can a PKI be compromised? What are those threats? What we find consistently, and we now see this demonstrated by the typical pen testing organization, PKI almost always fails a pen test because, again, there aren't the tools and experience that organizations are really leveraging to secure the PKI. So the pen test is kind of the easy underbelly to kind of point out, hey, there's something wrong with the PKI. What organizations are now realizing is these are no longer theoretical attacks. A couple of great papers that you can read. Spectre Ops organization put out a paper several years ago called Certified Pre-Owned. This focused on the Microsoft PKI, the Active Directory Certificate Services, the most common type of PKI in an organization. And they detailed 16 kind of very specific recipe style vulnerabilities. And frankly, this can exist with anything. We're just talking with key factors. BJBCA. That's their product instead of Microsoft PKI. And it's vulnerable to the same thing. It's all about enrollment. The reason that this is an issue is the threat vector is this. Almost every breach that you'll ever find in an organization started with some type of identity compromise. And the very first thing an adversary wants to do is how do I get more access? How do I get more privileged access from this basic thing I got. That PKI is the leading way for that to happen, simply because a misconfigured PKI will allow a low-level user, that compromised identity, to potentially request an identity as something else in the organization. And because the way PKI is structured, it is assumed that once a certificate is issued, it's valid and trustworthy. So if you have a PKI that's insecure, a low level compromised account can request an admin account, can request the CEO's identity on a
Mhm.
certificate. And it is assumed to be valid wherever it's used. It's really hard to track these things back. So there's a lot of great established recipes and white papers around these vulnerabilities. So it's even more important than just the theoretical pen testing.
So you said something to me that was really fascinating during our sort of pre-discussion, that there's sort of this spectrum that starts with certificate expiration to misconfiguration to pen test failures to actual high-end threats. And it sounded to me like, as you move from left to right across that spectrum, the frequency decreases, the amount of damage increases. And is that a good way to think about
Yeah,
it? Of
yeah, absolutely. No, we kind of talk about how that life cycle, the output of the factory, important problem, certificate life cycle management, and that can help. For instance, if a certificate expires or gets compromised, and that one web server, that one server is affected, and not to trivialize that's an important problem. The distinction is when the PKI becomes compromised. If we lose the ability to trust the identities coming out of the PKI, that means every identity that's come out of the PKI.
right,
That's a widespread problem. When we look at the resilience aspects, a misconfigured PKI that isn't reliable and isn't up and running to our operational needs means every certificate in the organization may temporarily be unable to be validated, which means those IDs, while secure, aren't
mhm,
functional. So for some of our retail customers, for instance, every cash register will have a certificate, very secure. It ensures all those transactions are functional, and they have a lifecycle management tool to make sure, oh, that cash register is valid. But when there's a problem in the PKI, that lack of resilience means their entire retail system goes down, even though the identities are secure. Now, from a security aspect, that's what we want, right? As CISOs, as organizational cyber professionals, we want a fail secure. From a business perspective, without that resilience, that security incident has now resulted in an outage. If we can't detect that, if it's a compromise, that's not an outage. That's simply a adversary who's escalated themselves to a much higher level of access. And that's really difficult to figure out. So anyone that's ever looked through the Microsoft Active Directory domain controllers or Azure trying to figure out what type of identity something used at some point in time, those logs are really hard to pull out. So it is a forensic discovery is very difficult. It's really just a matter of root cause analysis once a breach has been detected.
yeah. And you said something that just deeply resonated with me, and I've honestly not really been able to stop thinking about it since. And I'm gonna paraphrase you. So if I miss some nuance
All
here,
right.
please correct me. But the thing you said that really got my attention was you called recovery the weakest form of resilience, and talked about how we overfocus on recovery and not true resilience. And
Yeah,
that
exactly.
was just music to my heart, and I was wondering if you
Great,
could
great.
sort of expound on that and how you think about that.
Yeah, we see this argument a lot of times of, hey, our resilience plan is we'll just recover. We have a backup from a week ago. We have whatever. That's not really resilience. Like in my mind, it's good to have backups. I'm not
Mhm.
saying stop your backups, don't do those things. But when we really look at the core of things, when we're in a situation where we need to rely on a backup, we're in an outage. Whatever that system is, whatever that data is not currently in a trusted state. It's not operational. Whatever those things are. All that backup is doing is shortening the amount of time for me to rebuild. So we're only one step from saying my option, in case there's a breach, in case there's a configuration issue, in case there's an outage, is to rebuild. And the way I'm going to speed up my rebuild is I've got a backup. The other thing is to say, oh, I've got equipment in hold standby or sitting in some data center. I'm going to move the data over. That's just another shortcut to rebuild. For us, when we talk
Mhm.
about resilience, I think in a perfect world, resilience means the ability for a system to function even when it is in the middle of a breach, even when it's in the middle of a misconfiguration and a failure. How do we keep those things secure and functional under all circumstances? That the only time I'm really talking about recovery or backups is my entire data center is melted down and there's physically nothing left for me to do. I really have no choice but to rebuild. Again, why it's really important to have backups. But I think when we talk resilience, we need to say, how do I make this system more apt to follow my business availability needs? And how do I do that securely and meet my operational needs? And that's a challenge. I understand that. But I don't think backups is the way to have resilience in an organization.
Yeah, no, that's oh, spot on, spot on. I think I might have to put that one up on the wall just to help keep in perspective because I think it's just, not well understood and not well internalized just what kind of trade-off you're making there if that's your
Yeah,
only
and
option.
it's hard,
Yeah,
especially if you have leadership or budgets to say, "Oh, we have backups. That's our resilience plan." And it doesn't have to start with PKI. Maybe it's something that's closer to your day to day, but start thinking about resilience of how do I make this thing more secure. Now, if I
right.
got three legs on a stool, how do I add a fourth? If I got two legs, how do I add a third? Somewhere you have to start, and obviously PKI has a resilience factor to it, and thinking about these foundational technologies, DNS, DHCP, IP, PKI, these are all things that are foundational and may not be the top vernacular in the organization. But when they fail and they're not resilient, everything above gets affected. And that's something that we shouldn't really be overlooking.
Well, Mark, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate that you took the time to be on here with us and explain all of this. I think it's been extremely helpful for the audience. And please don't be a stranger. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. And I'll just leave you with a parting thought for your audience. If you're not the PKI person in your organization, you don't hear conversations coming up around identities and PKI. Don't assume someone else has their hands on this either. So start the conversation, reach out, be that good coworker, figure out if someone does own it, and maybe they need help. Maybe they need to hear this as well. But more often than not, we find out Bob built this, Bob left 5 years ago. We don't touch it. We sprinkle fairy dust on it and we leave it alone. Not a great way to run a foundational cyber program in your organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. And we will see you back here next month.